Charlotte, just introduce yourself a little bit for us and tell us who you are and why we're talking today, really. Tell us a little bit about who you are and Leicestershire Cares.
Great, yeah, thank you. So my name's Charlotte Roby-Turner. I'm the head of children and young people at Leicestershire Cares, and we're a small charity based in Leicester. We work across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, and we have a few different strands of work, but one of our key areas of work is supporting vulnerable young people, mainly aged sort of 16 to 25, into education, employment and training. So that includes working with young people in the care system, young people who have been involved in the criminal justice system, and young people experiencing homelessness, those kinds of groups, really.
Mm-hmm, that's beautiful. And I reached out to yourselves via Kieran, really, because of what you put out, the kind of statements you make about togetherness, connection, love at the centre of things. So that's partly why I reached out to say, we sound like a really interesting group of people working with young people, but centred in a place which wasn't, saturated with a lot of risk talk, but more about what are the strengths and what are the kind of powers of young people, to make those differences in their lives. Tell us a little bit about that before we head straight into these questions that I've got for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a charity, we are all based around partnerships and working together. So we have business members, we work with local community groups, really strong relationships with local authorities. But really key to our work is putting the young people at the centre of what we do. So we are kind of quite focused on what young people need, but also working with them. So we have a 3Ps approach. So we kind of start with the power two. So we work with them to kind of identify what they want to achieve and make sure that they feel able to kind of progress towards those goals. Then it's a sort of power with. So we're kind of working with them to really think about the things that have sort of changed, what they need to change in order to make their lives sort of better. And then it's a power onwards, I think, or I always forget the third one exactly, but that's more about them really using their voices to talk to local decision makers, even things as little as sort of talking to their own support workers about how they've treated them or worked with them and how they would prefer things to be done differently in the future. So it's always kind of building on their strengths, their experiences, and really working with them to kind of make change happen in their own lives, but also hopefully for other young people's lives as well. So
thank you so much for that, Charlotte. That's why I reached out to Leicestershire Cares, really, because I felt that energy and I felt that way that you're working. I know other places are doing it, but not enough places perhaps are doing it. And this project is about trying to find futures that may be in the present, so what are we doing now? How can we build on these and get this out there, in that national space around thinking about, how we work with and power up and help them power forward. Whatever your phraseology is, it doesn't matter to me. I get the spirit of it, so that's beautiful. So look, I'm going to ask you these questions and you just talk to where you think your strengths are. You don't have to go into areas that you don't feel comfortable with. Mm-hmm. That's why it's so broad, because you've spoken to people that are across all bits of those systems. So you go to where you want. So first question is, what are the current aspects of the current systems, some of them around youth justice. Obviously for Family Justice Observatory, we're focused on that kind of care proceedings, care system bit, but also the wider child welfare system. That doesn't just mean children's social care. It also means how children experience, housing, how they experience perhaps parts of education, how they experience, DWP, all of that stuff that's going on around employment. What are the things that you see as being obstacles in that system that kind of stop really good outcomes being achieved for adolescents in particular? And, in a sense, that's about, we know that the professionals want to be helpers and want to make a difference, but sometimes there are obstacles in the way of that. So could you give us a sense of how you see that from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that we've learned from our work is that the systems, certainly from a young person's perspective, often just don't seem joined up. So there might be decisions made in one part of the system which then impact them in another area of their lives, and then that other system has to kind of pick that up. But there's no kind of communication between the two different departments, or how things could be more joined up between different professionals in a young person's life. So a lot of our young people might have a social worker, a housing officer, a healthcare worker, a family support worker, and all these different professionals need to kind of work together to provide a holistic support model for a young person. But too often they kind of end up sort of clashing, I guess, or not kind of making coherent decisions together. So a really obvious example that not many people think about, and is something, a group that we're sort of starting to look at, is prisoners' children. So it might be that the justice system obviously makes a decision about one of their parents who then gets imprisoned, but then there's no subsequent thought really given to the children of that person who's put in prison. They're not given any particular special recognition or rights, despite the obvious, you can obviously think about the impacts that must have on that child's, well-being and their support in the family and their education. They're obviously, going to be very disrupted. So it's things like that really where we think that there's examples of where the system needs to be much more joined up. And I think a lot of that is around systems not doing what we really kind of champion, which is putting the young people at the heart of it. So if you look at it from a young person's perspective, they might be like, well, why is so-and-so telling me this, but then this other person is telling me this, and if I do that, it means that I won't be entitled to this housing benefit, but they, kind of really want me to get into work or this kind of stuff. So there's lots of different kind of competing messages coming through to young people, which might make sense to the professionals giving those messages, but they're probably not thinking about how that's received by a young person, if that makes sense. We think the criminalisation of children in care is a really good example of this as well. So the Howard League says that a young person who's in care is 15 times more likely to be criminalised than their peers, which is huge. And there's loads of reasons for that. And part of it is, their families are much more likely to live in poverty. So if you're a child who's taken into care, the likelihood is you come from a background of poverty. And people who live in poverty are also much more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. So there's a huge overlap there. And then things like if they're taken into care and they're in a children's home, then there's lots of policies and rules around practitioners having to ring the police if they go missing, or, if they get really angry and break stuff, then they end up getting the police called on them. Whereas if that was in a family home, you'd just, ground them and take their mobile phone off them. They end up with a criminal record. And that can really put them on a negative path from a very young age. So it's not, again, as you said, Beverly, it's not necessarily that the practitioners don't really want to help the young people. It's just that there's like systems and policies set up which just create those obstacles for young people being supported appropriately. And obviously they're like much more vulnerable to things like criminal exploitation as well. So I know there's like huge concern about this, especially kind of locally. So we ran a webinar on county lines recently and we had over 400 people attend, which is huge for us as a small charity. And a lot of concern about young people being placed in unregulated accommodation, and obviously the government's bringing in a ban for that for those aged under 16, but we can argue that 16, 17-year-olds are still children, and is it appropriate for them to be placed in that kind of accommodation? So there's a whole range of different things around housing and the justice system and the care system that all kind of interact to create these obstacles to providing effective support to young people and helping them achieve really good outcomes.
Charlotte, that's really interesting. So you're not the first person who's identified that fragmentation, and also that almost disintegrating systems in ways, because you've got, that fundamental split between health and care as well, haven't you, for young people? They're not integrated, so they're having to pull into two different parts all the time that, as you say, aren't talking to each other. When you're doing your work with Leicestershire Care and you're doing the kind of framing and you're working with in that local space, which I think is what's beautiful, because it is about that space, although it's big, because you've got Watton and Leicestershire, so it's a big county, so I know it's big. Yeah. It's the East Midlands, a big part of the East Midlands. When you're are you able to have conversations with those people in those places around the fact that it's a fragmented system? How are they thinking about, that way of working more in an integrated way, but more holistic way? What sort of response do you get as a charity when you raise those questions?
Yeah, I think we're quite lucky, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, that we have really good relationships with lots of different key stakeholders. So we can quite often bring people from different sectors together and really talk about issues. I think our local authorities are quite committed to working in partnership, particularly with the voluntary sector, and kind of working with different organisations who can provide a range of different support to their young people. And we have some really good committed like counsellors who are very interested in supporting young people in care. And Sarah Russell, who's the Deputy Mayor for Children's Services in Leicester City, is really keen and very good at like promoting their welfare and kind of she's actually really trying to get under like these kind of barriers between all these different departments and systems. But all that aside, we know that the outcomes for young people in care still aren't good enough. We still need to do a lot more to improve that. One of the things that we do, which I think is a bit different to other organisations, is because we have that link with the business community, we also try and bring employers into the mix, because businesses have a lot to offer, and I don't mean just financially, but they have staff who have skills and experience that they can share with young people, opportunities, a whole range of that real kind of connectivity, I guess, that a lot of young people, whether they're involved in the care system or the criminal justice system, generally find that they just don't have those social connections that so many of us rely on, particularly for our first kind of opportunities for work experience, and things like that. So actually bringing the business community in, I think, is something, I'm not saying we're unique in doing it, but we do it very well. And we have an initiative called the Promise to Care, which local businesses are signing to pledge their support for young people who are in or leaving care. And that's been really good. We've got over 60 signed up to that locally. And we're doing a whole range of things, even over the pandemic, around virtual work tours and mock interviews and getting them into apprenticeships and all sorts of different things. So I think I may have gone slightly off topic there, but I guess
no, I took you there because I wanted to get a flavour of what you're doing that's making that difference. So I purposely took you there. So that's not off topic. I just wanted to get a bit deeper into it, because what we're trying to find out is, where the difference is, part of the project, where is the difference? Because we want to highlight that throughout the programme, that when people tend to talk in terms of the circular nature of the problem, and they kind of get into that space, and it all then ends up in a discussion around what can we do? There aren't enough resources. And we know resources are an issue, but we can also have this creative space and this linking
absolutely.
up with business. And, when I was a social worker, there was no such opportunities to link business to young people leaving the care system, because young people are just seen as being, we wouldn't want any of those young people near our businesses. They'll ruin our businesses. So much stigmatization and so much negativity around young people, and a lot of them are carrying a load more criminal counts than they do these days, because every time anybody did anything in the children's home, they got called by the police and they were criminal damaged, criminal damage, letting go the fire alarm, criminal damage. It was unbelievable what was happening in the 90s, in the early 2000s with young people. And although it's a bit better, as you said, it still is a problem, isn't it? That's really interesting for me, because I love what you're doing. Is a lovely networking, knitting thing in your local spaces, finding where those change things can happen. So I really appreciated that, Charlotte. I'm going to gently move you on to the next question a bit, which is, which I sort of said, don't worry whether you've got free or not got free, it doesn't matter. And I'm sure Seth will come in and probe for more if he feels the need. But we've got the idea about, if you look at how things are at the moment, and particularly from your perspective, to stay in your own space in that sense, what are the three things that you see is really important, or two or three things is really important that is making that difference in the current system? If we were to think about an idealised future, which is our last question, what are the things that you're doing now, the three important things you see in terms of your perspectives? And also, what are some of the things you'd get rid of? One or two things you'd just say, let's just stop doing that today. We don't need to do that anymore. Over to you.
Yeah, great. So, at the risk of sort of repeating myself, I think it is that partnership working and those kind of interactions between all the different services, which is so important. I think also because, I think there's a lot of statutory services that are very willing now to engage with the voluntary sector, as I said. And because of what we do around putting the young people first, I think that really gives our young people the opportunity to kind of voice their experiences and their concerns and really raise awareness of what is happening to them on the ground. And I think that that's the real thing that we would really want to promote is, genuine kind of participation with young people. So not just tokenistic kind of, oh, here's a survey, fill this in and you've had your say, but really working with them to kind of explore, what is working, what isn't working, how can we make this better? Obviously, the government has recently announced its review of the care system, or actually it's more than that, isn't it? It's the whole of like the children's social services system in England, which we really welcome. And we think, the Scottish Care Review was a really good example of how, we can genuinely involve care experienced people in kind of reviewing the system that has impacted so much on their lives. These young people have really been through the whole system, and it makes a massive impact on their outcomes and stuff. So we really welcome that review. I know there's the Education Select Committee are looking to do a review of children's homes. There's a whole range of things that are going on at the minute, which is great because there's clearly a recognition that things need to change. And I think in light of the pandemic as well, we can't just keep going as we have been previously and sort of expecting small charities like ours to kind of pick up the pieces. And, we always say, in an ideal world, we just wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have a job because the system should be providing all the support and things that we actually sort of deliver. So I think it really is about that, about, putting young people at the centre of things, getting them to have a say in how services are developed and delivered. And that real partnership working. I mean, I mentioned the business community. We think too often the business community is left out of all these kinds of considerations. A lot of people in the business community are care experienced. They have experience with the criminal justice system. They're really keen to kind of give back, and they can provide real insight and real support to young people. We have lots of really committed volunteers that have done amazing things with our young people from the business community, and we think that more should be made of that as well. And I think something that's been really good in recent years as well is a kind of bit of a switch, really, I guess, to more. We're hearing a lot more about trauma-informed approaches to working with young people. The Violence Reduction Network that's been sort of set up across the country, our local one, is really good. Takes like a real public health-based approach to kind of working with young people and trying to find out the sort of root causes, I guess, of why young people end up involved in violent crime or violence, experiencing violence. So we think approaches like that are really good, where it's not just kind of, addressing what's happened, but more preventative work, we think is kind of key, and perhaps been lost over recent years, where there's been more of a focus on kind of, intervening further down the line rather than diverting young people away from the criminal justice system or the care system or whatever it might be, to be honest.
What do you think about what you? I mean, that sounds all like eminently sensible, Charlotte. Those are what we'd keep. What would you like, if you could have a magic wand? What would you say we should stop doing this today? Look at that system. What could we sort of say? Let's stop doing this. And the system won't collapse if we do.
I think this one's, it's kind of a bit tricky, really, because there's so many things you could say, isn't there? I think focusing on some really practical things. So I mentioned it earlier, the kind of unregulated accommodation. We just think there's been so much come out about that recently. We really welcome the government's move to, ban it for under 16-year-olds, but we don't think it goes far enough. We think any child, so therefore anyone under the age of 18, just really shouldn't be in unregulated accommodation. I know that they argue that some young people want it and they think that they're ready for it. But any of the young people that we've spoken to, that we work with, who've been in unregulated accommodation at that age, they often say, we thought we wanted it, we thought we could cope with it, but actually when you get there, you just they don't realise what they don't know and what they need to be able to do in order to live sort of even semi-independently. So we think that that's something that would be good, and it would reduce, hopefully, the numbers of young people who are so vulnerable to criminal exploitation in those homes, because it's just an absolutely massive issue. We've heard all these stories of young people being exposed to people who are dealing drugs or wanting them to hide things for them, and just getting involved in really, really negative behaviour and environments. So that's a key one, really.
In the Children's Commission, I think it was picked up that one or two organised crime groups, actually going into the children's homes business, or the unregulated, I should say, the unregulated support accommodation as a front to, target vulnerable young people,
Yeah, it's horrendous. And it's not difficult to find out where children's homes are either, and gangs can actually actively target those homes. So it's it's a real concern for everyone working in this sector. And I think when we talk to young people who've been through the care system, something that comes up again and again and again is how important stability is for them. So one of the things that we would get rid of, or at least change, is about kind of changing placements, changing social workers, changing personal advisors, having one person that goes with them through their time in care, and then one person who supports them in that transition from care to independent living is so important. We talk to young people who, during their A-levels, in one 18-month period, they were moved like 6-7 times. That's every quarter they were moved. And they're not even given like a bag, a rucksack to put their belongings in. It's bin bags. They put all their belongings in bin bags. And you have to reflect on thinking how that makes them feel in terms of what they're worth and how other people value them or don't, basically. So I think there's some really simple things you can change around. Once a young person is allocated a social worker, unless there's a really good reason, and we're aware, obviously, that social workers are employees and they can get other jobs and things like that, but don't just move young people around personnel for no reason, like it's
we do a lot of breaking of we have a system which actually builds in lots of breaking of relationships, because we move them around a process, don't we, where, well, you're no longer in this bit of the system, so you go to that person, and oh, I'm not doing that now, you go to leaving care now, or and it's really purposefully introducing breaking relationships, as well as stability of placement, stability of relationships, because even if you have a situation where you may be moving the place that you're living in, which is awful, even if you can have that key worker, isn't it, staying with you and knowing you and being with you through those journeys, it's a form of parenting, isn't it? It's a form of sticking with that young person. Yeah. It's interesting because we heard of No One Door, and that kind of promise to keep from 12 to 25, the same key worker or the same grouping of key workers around those young people. And that's like a major kind of North Yorkshire sort of offer there, in terms of that programme. And we heard about that in earlier interviews, and that was quite massively impressive. There's a kind of commitment there in the system to see if that can happen, barring that obviously workers can move on and get a new job or, and stuff like that. But that commitment that we've got a long life relationship or a longer lived relationship and not multiple relationships.
Yeah, so really important. And in terms of moving placement as well, if you're moving significantly, you move school and college, and a lot of our young people talk about the fact that they've not ever really been able to build long-term relationships with anyone because they're physically moved so much that they can't make friends, and it means that they're left kind of isolated. They start living independently, they're even more vulnerable to people kind of coming in and pretending to be their friends and then exploiting them, and they just find it really difficult to build meaningful relationships, which can mean that then they also end up in romantic relationships that are not healthy as well, because they're not really sure how to put in boundaries and things like that. So there's a whole range of...
It just has massive impact, doesn't it? Massive impact on their next bits of their life, the way that the life journey kind of goes. It's really, really powerful what you're telling us here and sharing with us, particularly because I know you spend a lot of time working with young people, and they're sharing this and doing things around it. I know I was telling my colleagues about your the book of my life story, my story that you've recently published. I'm not going to go to the next question yet. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think it flavours up what you're talking about, change there, about what young people were sharing in that work.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we were really lucky to get some funding from the Y Heritage Fund to look at care leavers' heritage. And this is a really fascinating project, because it wasn't really until we sort of started looking at it, my colleague who runs a lot of our leaving care work was thinking, this could be really interesting, because you don't normally think of young people in care or care leavers as having a heritage as such. And a lot of them, who were involved in the project talked a lot about how you lose personal belongings and photos and that connection to your family when you're taken into care. One of our young people said that when she was taken into care, her mum burnt a load of her personal items, so like toys and photos and things, so she hardly has anything that she can kind of bring with her into the care system, and again, because they're moved so often as well, things get lost along the way. So it was a really, really good project, and I think what was so powerful about it is, again, it was led by young people. So we had 2 care leavers who were apprentices on the project who were paid to kind of lead and shape it. We had a good range of young people involved in it. So we had some unaccompanied asylum seeking young people involved, as well as young people who've been involved in the care system in this country. And that was really interesting to hear their different kind of takes on, how they viewed their heritage. But I think a lot of them were talking about, the kind of positive aspects of being in care, and really taking ownership of their identity as being a care leaver and using that as a positive thing. And we were really moved when we did the launch event the other week, how many people joined that event and commented on how it's something that people just have never really thought about or spoken about before. So the book is great.
They're not working with and empowering up young people, aren't they? That's part of the lesson to learn, isn't it? That's where the system change work happens, because it's actually people going back and reflecting. We're missing the responsibility here, aren't we? Because we need to be working differently. So we're hearing that because it's there. Of course, they have a heritage, don't they?
And I think it reflects a lot. I think Casey, who was one of the young people who was an apprentice, and her introduction to the book, which is available on our website to download for free if you would like to have a copy. She comments on how a lot of the focus is on the negative things when you're in care. It's what you don't have, it's what you've lost, it's what, the challenges that you face. And there's not a lot of discussion generally around, this is what you're good at, these are your strengths, these are the positive things that you've got out of care. And it was really nice to hear a couple of stories in that book about how being in care had been a positive experience for some of the young people, because I actually don't hear those stories so much. There's a lot of negative kind of impacts where those young people were saying, if I'd have stayed in my family home, I'd been in a much worse position than I am now.
I think that's really powerful, because there's something really powerful there about when we talk about the stigmatisation of care and the stigma. And it's often a creation of people who are often researching the system and looking at the really poor outcomes.
Yeah.
And there will be balance work around, where does it work effectively, where it doesn't work effectively. And it isn't really for us to prescribe that, is it? It's about young people sharing and talking about that experience and what they think they've gained or not gained.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, because there's something really important about a state and a ethics of care that says that we should be caring for young people when they can't be cared for in their families. We shouldn't be thinking we don't have a responsibility to a wide group of children, because there's a little bit of danger when you kind of critique care as it's a terrible thing and you should never have a system and everybody should work towards keeping children at home. Of course, if you're intervening early enough and helping families, that is obviously the first response, should be about that. But we're in circumstances where care can be seen as a space for creating opportunities for change for the family and for the young person. When I became a social worker, we would often have the children's home that I was based in, it would be like a respite place. You get me? So kids would just come for a couple of weeks because things were kicking off in the family. You're doing all that outreach work and working with the family, and then the young person will go home. It became like, well, that's instability, because care is about permanency. But permanency for adolescents it's a difficult concept, because it's adaptation, isn't in growth periods. So you're moving and changing all the time and trying to find out ways of understanding the world around you. So you need to be maybe thinking permanency in a different way when you think about adolescence, which is about caring, isn't it? And being in a caring relationship. And like you're saying, that stable adult presence in your life, and that opportunity to learn how to link in and connect to, because that's what the difference is with young people that don't receive it. For those who have remained in family, even when it's tough, you're still connected to parts of the systems that you can get hold of. Do you get me? When you're in that system, absolutely. You're very reliant on that social worker or other person to plug you in, because you just don't have those means, and have those tools. So that's really interesting to hear that. And I think that's powerful, because what we don't want is a world that decides we don't need to invest in better care, because we do actually want you to invest in the system. And for example, 16 and 17-year-olds are still children, they need care, not just an idea of some sort of support. They still need caring and being cared for, so I think that's a really important point you're making there. And I think there is a way of thinking around that, because there is a way of it being about, a stigmatizing process, but actually the way we frame it can be different as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's powerful. That's really important. Thank you so much for that, Charlotte. I could go on and talk about that area a lot because it's a big thing for me. For many 30 years in the business, it's a big thing for me, that space. Because I do often think we need to be thinking about families and how we support families with a care system, how we could create opportunities for a bit of a break and a bit of a rest and not being seen as a terrible thing. Okay, I really appreciate that, Charlotte. I'm going to move you on a little bit into the kind of dream story that we've got now. So if you were able to wake up tomorrow morning and the universe said to you, Charlotte Roby-Turner, I give you the power to determine what a future system should look like for young people, what the vision of a caring, perhaps, system looks like, a together system looks like. What would that be for you? How would you phrase that? How would you frame that? How would Leicestershire Care frame that?
Yeah, we've done quite a lot about this actually. Our chief exec Kieran's written some really good articles about how we would envisage, a good, particularly around the care system, because we do quite a lot of work with young people in the care system, and we think it's, again, kind of bringing together everything that I've sort of been talking about. Really, it's really about that kind of joined up approach across all the different services and departments that are involved in working with young people, but really placing the child and young person at its centre. So it's kind of recognising the full role that everyone has to play, yes, in keeping young people safe, yes, in protecting them from harm, but really challenging and encouraging them to achieve their potential. So it's not just a kind of risk averse, keep them close, keep them, away from harm, but really equipping them with the skills, the experience, the life knowledge that they need to make those successful transitions into adulthood and independent living, and then to really become active and positive contributors to their local communities. So we think we need to avoid this kind of top-down model where decisions are kind of too often made by people who are removed from that lived experience of young people, and kind of really focus it much more on the needs of young people and vulnerable sort of families and adults, really, that kind of genuinely involves them and communities in sort of developing services which support them and work for them as well. Too often we just find that things that are put in place with good intentions just end up just not working and fragmenting, like we've been talking about, and it just creates all this bureaucracy and a minefield of things, not just for the young people but for practitioners to try and navigate as well. And I think it's just kind of bringing together all the different stakeholders who have a part to play in really providing young people with the kind of support base that they need to recognise their strengths and have aspirations for their futures, and really want them to progress and develop in ways that means that they live really meaningful and fulfilled lives. In short, I don't know if that's it's aspirational, but
I think aspiration is something which is vital, because it is about creating a sense that things can be achieved, things can be done, and you can live, you can determine what a good life looks like for you. And it doesn't have to be shaped by adults who think that's good enough for you. You can be in a world where you determine that, because you grow up with that opportunity as a human being for growth and development, and you want to be in a system that perhaps that enables that to happen. Let me put a bit of a universe challenge to you. So the universe says, Charlotte, I love your aspiration. I love your talk of closer to the community and maybe people closer to people doing this work. So the universe says to you, here's £10 billion
oh my goodness,
that you could have. But actually, in that £10 billion, we're going to take £10 billion away from existing child and adolescent mental health services, or 150 social workers will have to be let go of, or X, Y, and Z would need to happen. But in that, you create opportunities for you to do that much more, community-centred ways of working. What do you do, Charlotte, if the universe comes to you and says that's the solution? The solution is to shift the funding over here and close down some of the other activity.
I mean, my counter-argument to that is I would feel like an approach which was much more young person and family centred, and that really removed a lot of those bureaucratic approaches that we've talked about, and that kind of risk averse nature would really actually mean that money would would turn into creating more opportunities and more of those kind of roles. So rather than losing this many social workers, maybe those social workers would be able to not spend 60% of their time filling in paperwork, but could actually work more with the young people. So perhaps, I'm not saying you would need less social workers, but they would be able to use their time more sort of effectively. I mean, one of the things that we've sort of seen throughout the pandemic is communities really stepping up and really showing willingness to engage with their local people, local community groups, food banks and things like that. There's a lot of willingness and skills and creativity out there that's just untapped and we're not drawing in. So I don't know if it really is even a question of funding. Maybe it is kind of redirecting resources initially, but once you kind of develops that new approach, which really taps into what the business sector can offer, what local community groups can offer, what the person down the street can offer, then you would create a lot more resource and value for the young people to kind of draw on anyway. And so actually, I don't know if that would, not only replace but enhance kind of the value of what was happening in the sector. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I love that you dropped in what value is to get me, and how and what that value, augmenting that value and what value really means, in that sense, beyond the idea of the money pot, but actually creating that, opening up what's already there and creating systems that allow that to come in. You'd hope would have that impact. It would make people think about how they are currently using concepts around value for money and how they are seeing the spend. And, as you say, the social worker spending 65% of their time processing paperwork and only maybe 30% being alongside families and children. If you were able to have a system which allowed for that to be 80 to 20, which is some of the campaigning work going on, what value would you get out of that exchange? I suppose, in a sense, there is a lot of debate at the moment about, do we have a social care system which is just about that top end of child protection, and should the rest of it be done elsewhere and not be done within the Children's Social Care Services Department? Or would it mean that you would actually be making a false dichotomy there between young people who end up at risk of harm and young people in need and young people in need of support? Because if you're taking a holistic model, you'd hope that all of that would have perhaps impact. It's a debate. I know that's current. That's probably why I was a bit naughty and probed you on it a little bit. But yeah. I really appreciate your response to that, because I think it's a fantastic way of responding, which is, it is perhaps, a provocation without it actually being the reality, of what is actually achievable. Yeah. Anything else you want to say to us really about that vision? I mean, I love what Karen writes, and I love what you lot produce. I know I can see it is a really different kind of future, around young people. And we, what's lovely is you don't fall into this kind of privatisation versus public sector stuff. It's a holistic, what does a whole community, including its business community, do to look after its children in its village, almost, isn't it?
Absolutely, and you kind of preempted what I was going to say as my kind of thing, which is, Kieran wrote that article which says it takes a village to raise a child, and I think what ultimately our vision would be is that everyone in society, whoever they are, recognise that these young people are our children. They're not just the children of the state is us, and we all have a responsibility to these young people to help them achieve their potential and, make, good transitions, positive transitions into a meaningful and fulfilling life.